Radial gradients are like linear gradients that start from a center point and smoothly spread out in a circular or elliptical shape based on the parameters we set. Let's have a look. We can think of radial gradients as linear gradients that start from the center of a circle and radiate out based on the parameters we set. So instead of fading from one side of an element to the other, they instead emerge from a center point and smoothly spread out in a circular or elliptical shape. Radial gradients are a little more complex than linear gradients only because there are more options and parameters we can use to define the gradient. And the syntax is similar to linear gradients, except that we can specify the gradient shape as a circle or ellipse, as well as its size. Radial gradients are defined using the radial gradient functional notation. So again, in the background property of our box rule, we'll type out WebKit since I'm using Chrome, followed by radial, gradient, and a set of parentheses. Next, we'll define the gradient with two colors. So we'll type E3A112. Then our next hue, which is a dark blue. So this will go from an orange to a dark blue. Now, by default, the shape of a radial gradient is an ellipse, and it has the same proportions as the containing element. So let's save this out and view it in the browser. So now when we refresh this, we see that the gradient is centered in the div and is large enough to fill it entirely to each of the corners. Even if we increase the width of our box div to say 700 pixels, the gradient maintains its proportions. Now, to change the shape from elliptical to circular, we'll just need to add the circle keyword before the list of colors, followed by a comma. So now the end shape of our gradient is a perfect circle, and it no longer follows the div's proportions like the elliptical shape. And we can see more of the blue color in the left and right sides of our box. We can then position exactly where the gradient center should be within our div. For example, in our CSS, before our circle value here, I will add a value of 150 pixels, followed by 50 pixels and a comma. Now this is very similar to how the background position property sets the position of a background image. The first value will set the horizontal position beginning from the left, and the second value sets the vertical position beginning from the top of the element. So we'll save this and refresh. And we see the very center of the gradient positioned 150 pixels from the left and 50 pixels from the top. The gradient can also be set with percentages, which then relate to the dimensions of the box. And like background position, if we only define one value, the second value will default to center. So when we refresh this, the gradient is now 75% from the left, and it's vertically centered. We can take things further and add other extended keywords to specify the size of the gradient's ending shape. For example, in our circle gradient, we can add the value closest side after circle. With closest side, the ending shape meets the sides closest to its center, which in this case is the vertical sides, because our width is larger than the height. Now, if we increase the height to, say, 800 pixels, the gradient now meets the horizontal sides of the div because they're now the closest to the center of the gradient. In elliptical gradients, it meets both the horizontal and vertical sides closest to the center. So I'll go ahead and remove circle so we can see how that looks like. With the value closest corner, the gradient's ending shape is sized so it meets the closest corner from its center. So I'll go ahead and remove this, and I'll once again add a horizontal position of 75%, then a vertical position of 25%, and we will make this a circle-shaped gradient. We'll save this and review it in the browser. We see the center positioned near the top right corner. But let's see what happens when we add the value closest corner. When we review it in the browser and refresh, notice how it sizes the gradient shape to meet up with the top right corner of the div, because it's the closest to its center. The value farthest side is like closest side, except the ending shape is sized to meet the sides that are farthest from the center. So we'll change this to farthest side. We'll refresh this and see that it expands to the top left corner, while the origin remains 75% from the left and 25% from the top. In elliptical shapes, it meets with the farthest vertical and horizontal sides. Finally, the value farthest corner is the opposite of closest corner, so the gradient's ending shape is sized so it exactly meets the farthest corner from the center. So we'll change side to corner, and when we refresh the browser, we see that the ending shape sizes to meet the farthest corner from the center. Now, this is actually the default value, so we can omit it and it will maintain its size and position. Color stops in radial gradients are defined as a list just as we would for linear gradients. So we'll go ahead and add another color and we'll make it a value of green. So we'll type 3B, DB, 0B. The first color defined starts from the center, then progresses towards the end or further according to the specified color stops. And we can also add the color stop position values in percentages, pixels, or em units. So we'll add a color stop position of 30% for the blue value and a value of 600 for our green color. Let's take a look at this in the browser. So now the blue color reaches its full color value at 30% from the center, and the green value reaches its full green hue at 600 pixels from the center of our gradient. With radial gradients, the gradient line extends out from the starting position in all directions. So we can actually go beyond 100% depending on our desired result. So we'll change this from 600 to 120%, and we can see how it extended that value past the dimensions of our box. So with what we know about radial gradients, we can now create some pretty neat effects. I'll quickly show you what I mean. Back in our CSS, I'll go ahead and change the width to 300 and also make the height 300. Then I will add a border radius of 50% to make it a circular shape. And we'll define a new gradient. So I'll start with a 65% horizontal position and a 15% vertical position. I'll make this a circle. Then I'll add a color of aqua, followed by dark blue. Now let's take a look at what this looks like. So we'll save this out, and when we refresh this, we can see how it creates a sort of three-dimensional sphere. It's pretty neat.